All right, welcome back to AI Paper Podcast. You know how this works. We grab a paper, pull out the big ideas, and really get into the nitty-gritty. And today, we're looking at something pretty fundamental. Long-form video understanding, something a lot of people are talking about. But this paper, I think, takes a really fresh approach. In fact, for our short-form listeners, let me just lay it out there. This research basically reimagines the way AI finds specific moments in these massive videos. They're calling it Temporal Search. And instead of brute forcing it, which is just computationally insane, they treat it more like a spatial search problem, kind of borrowing from how AI already excels at finding objects in images.
Very clever, actually.
Yeah, right? They even built this whole new benchmark called LV-HASTACK. Get it? Like finding a needle in a haystack, only it's a crucial frame in hours of footage. And it's all real-world videos with actual human annotation, so none of that synthetic stuff that doesn't quite capture the real-world messiness.
Definitely. And they've got this lightweight framework, T-Star, that utilizes visual localization techniques and kind of zooms in on the important parts, both in terms of, where in the video to look and also within the frame itself.
Right, so it's doing this double zoom in time and space.
Exactly. And the results, well, they've managed to significantly boost the performance of those big leading video language models on these long video understanding tasks, and all that while keeping the computational demands in check, which is a huge win.
Absolutely, and that's why we wanted to do this deep dive today. For our regular listeners, we're going to break down exactly how they achieve these results and why it matters. Now, you brought this paper to the table, and I got to say, it really struck a chord with me. This problem of efficiently understanding long videos, it feels like a fundamental bottleneck that's just going to become more and more pressing as video data sets explode in size.
Yeah, totally. Think about it. Lectures that stretch for hours, those egocentric videos that capture entire days of someone's life. There's a gold mine of information in there, but if AI can't find it quickly and efficiently, it's basically useless.
Right, like trying to find a specific conversation in weeks of security camera footage. It's just not feasible to process every single frame with these huge vision language models we have.
Especially considering that some of these models, as the paper highlights, are incredibly computationally demanding even for a single image.
Yeah, and when you multiply that by tens of thousands of frames in a long video, well, you can quickly see how things get out of hand computationally.
Exactly. Now, what I found particularly elegant about this paper is how the authors sort of took a step back and questioned the whole paradigm of temporal search. The conventional approach, trying to identify a continuous segment of video where an event unfolds, they kind of toss that out and introduce this new concept, what they're calling the long video haystack problem.
The long video haystack problem. I love that name. For our listeners, I think it really captures the essence of this challenge, right? It's like sifting through this enormous haystack of video frames to find the crucial needles, those few keyframes that hold the key information.
Exactly. And they make a very important distinction between this and traditional temporal localization. Temporal localization is about identifying a time interval, right? Where something happens continuously.
Right, like from second 30 to second 45, something happens.
Exactly. But here, the focus shifts to selecting a very specific set of individual frames, a minimal set, which may or may not be consecutive. So these keyframes, they might be scattered throughout the entire video timeline, but when you put them together, they have all the necessary information to answer your question.
So it's not just about finding where something starts and stops. It's about identifying the most informative moments, even if they're spread out. Like one frame might show someone picking up a tool, another frame shows them using it, and another shows the final product, even though those moments are minutes apart.
Perfect example. And crucially, this identified set of keyframes has to have two key properties, as the authors emphasize. First, completeness. The chosen frames need to provide all the info to accurately answer the query. And second, minimality. You don't want any redundant or irrelevant frames in there. Every frame should be contributing unique information.
Makes sense from a computational perspective. You're cutting out all the fat, getting right to the meat of the matter.
Yeah.
And that naturally leads to the question, how do you even measure how well a model is doing at this kind of precise, targeted temporal search?
Great question. And this is where their first big contribution comes in, the introduction of this LV-HasteStack Benchmark dataset. They saw a real limitation in the existing needle and haystack datasets because many of them used synthetically inserted frames or manipulated footage, and they argued that that doesn't really reflect the challenges of real-world long-form videos.
Right, like spotting a frame that's been obviously inserted is a different beast than finding these subtle but crucial moments in hours of natural footage.
Absolutely. So they went all out and built LV-HasteStack with 480 hours of real-world video. That's a lot of video. And on top of that, they have 15,092 human-annotated instances, specifically designed to train and evaluate these temporal search capabilities. And they use two sources that a lot of our listeners will recognize. Ego4D, which focuses on those egocentric first-person recordings, and Long Video Bench, which offers that third-person allocentric perspective.
Now, Ego4D, for those who might not be as familiar, it's a massive collection of everyday activities recorded from a wearable camera. How did the researchers go about annotating that portion of the dataset?
So for Ego4D, they did this big annotation effort, creating 15,092 question-answer pairs. They spread these across 988 videos, with each video averaging about 25 minutes long. And they ended up with roughly 15 questions per video, each one paired with carefully selected keyframes. Now for Long Video Bench, they were able to utilize the existing keyframe annotations and the answers that were already there, but they refined the timestamps, because the goal was to make sure that those selected frames were truly the minimal set needed to answer the question.
Really making sure they're finding those needles and not getting bogged down in extra hay, so to speak.
Exactly. Now, of course, having this massive data set is only half the battle. To properly assess performance, you need the right evaluation metrics. And the paper makes a great point about how previous evaluations often just focus on the overall task accuracy. Did the model get the answer right? But they kind of ignored how efficiently it got there.
Like a model could potentially stumble upon the right answer by processing tons of irrelevant frames just through sheer brute force.
Exactly. So to address this, the researchers introduced what they call frame-centered temporal and visual metrics. These metrics look at the alignment between the model-selected frames and the human-annotated keyframes. They consider both how close they are in time and how similar they are in terms of visual content.
So you're not just saying, did the model find the right moment? You're also asking, did it find the right moment for the right reasons with minimal wasted effort?
Right. They also introduced frame set similarity metrics, things like temporal and visual F1 scores. And these are designed to provide a more holistic comparison between the entire set of frames the model selects and that ideal set identified by humans.
So a really thorough evaluation of the search process itself.
Yeah.
And what did these initial results on LV-HasteStack reveal about the state of temporal search in AI?
Let's just say it highlighted a pretty big gap. Even those state-of-the-art methods, they struggled when it came to actually identifying that minimal set of crucial frames. To give you an example, on the Long Video Bench subset, the best performing methods only got a temporal F1 score of 2.1%.
2.1%, that's humbling.
Yeah.
It really underscores how far we have to go in enabling AI to find information in long videos in a truly efficient way. So having laid out the problem and a way to measure progress, the paper then shifts to their proposed solution, the T-Star framework. And this is where things get really interesting.
Right. Inspired by how successful visual search techniques have been in still images, where AI can quickly pinpoint a specific object within a frame, the researchers came up with T-Star, their lightweight temporal search framework. And the core idea is this. They reframe the computationally expensive temporal search across a video into a more manageable spatial search problem.
Temporal search as spatial search.
Yeah.
That's a pretty neat conceptual jump. How do they actually make that work?
So T-Star takes advantage of these powerful visual localization techniques that we already use in image processing. Think about an object detection model drawing a bounding box around a particular object in an image. Well, T-Star adapts this to the temporal domain, and it introduces this adaptive zooming in mechanism that works in 2 dimensions. It decides what part of the video to focus on, but also what visual details within a frame are important.
It's like simulating that human attention, starting broad and then zeroing in on the areas of interest, both in terms of time and the visual specifics within the frame.
Exactly. Now, the T-Star framework has 3 main phases: question grounding, iterative temporal search, and downstream task completion.
Let's break those down, starting with question grounding. What happens in this first phase?
The goal here is to extract the key visual concepts from the question you're asking, and then you identify those corresponding target objects and cue objects within the video itself. Target objects are the things directly related to answering the question.
So if the question is, where do they put the red cup? Then the red cup would be the target object.
Exactly. And Q objects are things that might indicate where you'd find that target object. So in that example, it might be things like table, hands, or kitchen counter, things that are contextually related.
Like visual hints that could lead you to the target object.
Right. To achieve this, they sample a small number of frames from the beginning of the video and feed those frames, along with the question, into a vision language model. That VLM then tries to identify these target and cue objects within those initial frames.
So it's like a quick scan to get a sense of what to look for and maybe where to start looking. Then we get to the heart of the system, that iterative temporal search. How does this actually work? How do they turn a temporal search into a spatial one?
Right, this is where the real magic happens. They start with a uniform probability distribution across all the frames of the video. So initially, every frame is equally likely to be relevant.
Everyone gets a fair shot at the viewing.
Exactly. Then, in each iteration, the algorithm samples a set of frames based on this probability distribution. Now, here's the clever bit. Instead of processing these frames in their temporal order, one after another, they arrange them spatially in a grid. Almost like creating a mosaic of frames taken from different parts of the video.
So you're taking snippets from different moments in time and putting them together like a single image.
Exactly. And then a pre-trained object detection model is applied to this entire spatial grid. It's looking for those target and cue objects that were identified in the first phase. And the key output here is a confidence score for each cell in the grid. So how likely is it that the target object is actually present in that specific frame?
And this allows the algorithm to then narrow its focus to the parts of the video that look most promising.
Precisely. Frames or temporal regions where the object detection model is very confident about the presence of those target objects, those get marked as more important. And then the probability distribution for the next iteration is updated to give more weight to those promising regions. So they're essentially zooming in on the parts of the video that are most likely to contain the answer.
Like those crime dramas where they enhance the footage and zoom in on the one detail that cracks the case.
Right. And conversely, those frames where the target objects aren't detected with enough confidence, they get downweighted and are less likely to be sampled in the next round. So the search space is pruned with each iteration.
It's an iterative process of refining the search, constantly redirecting resources based on visual evidence.
Exactly. And this whole sampling, scoring, and reweighting process goes on until either the target objects are found with a high degree of confidence or they hit a predefined budget, like a maximum number of frames they're allowed to process.
It sounds way more efficient than analyzing every single frame.
Yeah.
So once this iterative search is done, then what? That's where the downstream cast completion comes in.
Right. After the iterative search, they pick the top K-frames, a small set determined by their final scores, and those become the keyframes. These are the frames that get fed into a regular vision language model to actually answer the original question. And the idea is that because T-Star has already done the heavy lifting of finding the most relevant moments, the VLM can just focus on those and do its reasoning on this much smaller, highly informative set of frames.
Okay, so streamlined and efficient. And the paper provides some empirical evidence to show that T-Star actually works.
Oh, absolutely. They've got some pretty compelling results across different benchmarks. Looking at computational efficiency, their analysis showed that this iterative approach achieves a 3 times reduction in FLOPs compared to the baseline of processing all frames.
3 times. That's a huge improvement, especially when you're talking about real-world deployment. What about the actual performance gains on those long video understanding tasks?
Well, on the long video bench XL subset, which has the longest videos in the benchmark, they saw some impressive gains in accuracy when they integrated T-Star with existing state-of-the-art VLMs. And this was even under a strict inference budget of only 32 frames. For example, GPT-4o went from 50.5% accuracy to 53.1%.
Not a bad boost.
Right. And LV One Vision OV72B jumped even more significantly from 56.5% accuracy to 62.4%.
Okay, so real improvements with a fraction of the computational cost. The paper also goes into some detail about the search utility results on that LV-HasteStack benchmark they created.
Right. Table 2 in the paper breaks down the performance using metrics like precision, recall, and F1 scores. And they're specifically looking at the temporal and visual similarity between the model-selected frames and the human annotated ground truth.
So really getting granular about how well the search process is working.
Exactly. And one thing that really pops out is that their detector-based T-Star consistently outperforms the other methods, particularly in that challenging 32-frame setting. This really suggests that leveraging visual grounding, that identification of target and cue objects, is really powerful for guiding the search.
Makes sense. The visuals give you a strong starting point to narrow down the search space. And Table 3 in the paper compares T-Star to other adaptive search strategies like Video Agent. What do they find in terms of computational cost and latency?
Yeah, so Table 3 really reinforces the efficiency of T-Star. It shows that it can achieve comparable, if not better, performance than those other adaptive methods, but with way less computation measured in TFLOPs and also lower latency. For instance, the training-based T-Star had significant improvements in both computational efficiency and search time compared to Video Agent, and it also achieved higher overall task accuracy.
So faster, leaner, and more accurate. Not a bad combination.
Right. And they didn't just stop there. They also wanted to see how T-Star performed on video question answering datasets with shorter videos, not just those ultra long ones.
Because ultimately, you want a system that can handle a variety of video lengths.
Right. And as you can see in tables 4, 5, and 6 in the paper, T-Star delivered consistent improvements when paired with different VLMs, regardless of the video length. And while the benefits were most obvious for those longer videos, which is what it was designed for, it was also competitive or even better on shorter video QA datasets like NextTQA and EgoSchema, and it often achieved this using fewer frames than the other methods. They even tested it on a new Ego4D long video QA dataset they put together, and again, T-Star came out on top when combined with models like WEN 2.5VL and GPT-4o. So it seems this idea of efficiently distilling information through targeted search is pretty broadly applicable.
That's encouraging to see. Now, for those of our listeners who are into the more theoretical side of things, the paper also does a complexity analysis of the T-Star framework. What are the highlights there? How computationally complex is this system?
Well, they show that in the best case scenario, where the object detector gives really accurate guidance early on, T-Star actually has logarithmic time complexity with respect to the video length, which is amazing. It's like a really well-optimized multi-branch search. But in the worst case, where the guidance is poor, it could degrade to linear search.
So the performance can vary depending on how well the object detector can narrow down the search.
Right. On average, the complexity falls somewhere between those two extremes, and it's influenced by the probability of the heuristic scoring function actually picking the right temporal regions to focus on. They also break down the computational overhead of that initial question grounding phase and the object detection that's happening on that grid of sampled frames.
Okay, so they've really thought through the computational aspects. Figure 3 in the paper gives us a visual representation of how T-Star's sampling weights evolve over time. What's the takeaway from that visualization?
Yeah, Figure 3 is really helpful for getting an intuitive understanding of what's going on. It visually shows how the model's attention, which is represented by those sampling weights, gradually concentrates on the ground truth keyframes, the ones the human annotators identified. So you can see that iterative refinement process actually working, zeroing in on the right parts of the video.
It's like watching the model learn to focus its attention on the most informative moments.
Exactly. And it even shows how the model can simultaneously focus on keyframes that are far apart in the video timeline. So it's not just about localizing to a single region, it's about picking out the key moments across the entire video.
And Figure 4 looks at the effect of changing the number of frames that T-Star is allowed to search. What does that tell us about the relationship between computation and performance?
Figure 4 shows a pretty clear trend. As you increase the number of frames T-Star can search, the performance of those VLMs that are using T-Star, it gets better and better. It eventually approaches the performance you get when using those perfect human-annotated oracle frames.
So the more frames you process, the better the results. But the whole point of T-Star is to do this with minimal computation.
Right. And the key takeaway is that T-Star can actually achieve performance comparable to those oracle frames with a relatively small fraction of the total frames, especially compared to those methods that just sample uniformly. They actually found that with a budget of around 64 frames, T-Star's performance was pretty much on par with using all the human-annotated keyframes.
That's impressive. Now, the authors do point out some limitations and areas for future research, right?
Yeah, they acknowledge that their assumption that most video understanding tasks can be solved with a few keyframes that might not hold true for every situation, particularly tasks that require a more holistic understanding of the entire video, or tasks that involve complex temporal reasoning over long periods.
Like tasks where the context over time is just as important as the individual moments.
Exactly. They also point out that their current framework is primarily relying on visual cues, which makes sense given the spatial search approach. But they suggest that incorporating other modalities like audio and text from subtitles could further improve the robustness and performance.
It's like adding more senses to the search process, allowing the model to consider more information.
Right. And that's definitely an exciting avenue for future research.
Well, this deep dive into the Rethinking Temporal Search for Long-Form Video Understanding paper has been fascinating, to say the least. They've really put forward a compelling approach to a problem that's only going to become more important as we deal with more and more video data.
I completely agree. I think just introducing that LV-HasteStack benchmark is a major contribution in itself. It gives the research community a much-needed, rigorous platform to evaluate these temporal search methods on real-world data. And those surprisingly low F1 scores that even the state-of-the-art methods got on this benchmark, it really highlights how tricky this problem is and why we need new approaches like T-Star.
And T-Star itself, with that clever reframing of temporal search as a spatial problem and that adaptive zooming mechanism, it's definitely promising direction. Those empirical results, showing significant performance boosts for those big VLMs while also being computationally efficient, those are really compelling. So for our listeners out there who are working on AI research and development, what do you think about all this? Does this idea of turning temporal search into spatial search, does it resonate with you? Does it connect to any challenges you're facing in your work?
Absolutely. What strikes me is how elegantly they've taken those techniques that were developed for image processing and applied them to this very different domain of video understanding. And like you mentioned, those efficiency gains could be game-changing when you're working with massive video data sets.
And I think it's also worth highlighting how the paper really pushes the importance of developing specific metrics to evaluate search utility. It's not just about getting the right answer, it's about how you get there.
Right. Efficiency and accuracy go hand in hand, and the fact that the authors are open about the limitations of their approach and point towards those potential future directions, that's always a good sign.
It shows they're thinking critically about the bigger picture.
Right. And that question of how to integrate other modalities like audio and subtitles, that's a really fascinating one. It could unlock a whole new level of performance and robustness for these temporal search systems.
Absolutely. And as these AI models get better at extracting information from these long videos, it makes you wonder how it's going to change the way we interact with video content. Will we be able to search through hours of footage effortlessly, find exactly what we need in seconds? How will this impact learning, analysis, even entertainment? It's a pretty exciting time to be working in this field. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back with more fascinating research soon.